4, 3, 2, 1. Kickoff. We have kickoff of this week's edition of Unvarnished Football. Going to talk NFL free agency, and which starts next week. And we're going to talk a little bit about Lou Holtz, who our football community lost very recently. The great coach. Upton's going to share some stories about him, but we'll get right to the free agency picture. You know, the Patriots are about to release Stephon Diggs. That's what the reports are. Tyreek Hill has been released. I mean, it seems like the wide receiver pool is looking pretty good. If you're looking for a playmaker, Upton, what do you see going into this free agency?
Well, let me first take the audience back to what we were then and what we are now. And the big difference in the NFL and their form of alleged free agency, which is ridiculous, is that years ago, a player like Stephon Diggs, who is definitely going to be released by the Patriots, who had a very good year for them, didn't show up much in particularly in the Super Bowl or a couple of the playoffs, but he really helped Drake May develop as a quarterback. He was a deep and medium threat, but he's 33 years old, and he's got a salary supposedly next 2 years, which totals near 40, 50 million dollars. Well, if you go all the way back when there was no free agency and when teams kind of kept their roster together, a guy 33 would be considered, yes, somewhat on the edge, but they would keep him because it wasn't costing them anything. When I was with the Colts, and even watching the Eagles teams, there were plenty of players that were 30 and over. And let's face it, again, you and I have talked in the past that, the average life of a player in 1946, when I went to the Bears training camp, was 3.5, maybe 4 years if you're lucky. It's still the same today. And because the players are bigger, quicker, stronger, faster, it might even be less because of the injury factor, which has always been there. But when you had teams that had players 30 and over, you probably saw your roster with a lot of them because coaches felt by then they had really matured and really were intelligent and really understood the game, because it does take a long time to learn, even back then, the game itself. So today, what are you giving up in some ways by having what I call it, free agency? And that is basically the player when you're making too much money, you have to know, wow, I'm in the danger zone because they're going to look at me and they're going to say, as they did with Diggs and other players in the NFL, as we look at the free agency list here.
Happens every year. We see it every year. Every
That
year, it's the same thing. So this year's
and
no different in that regard.
so how many, Michael? How many players out there? Let's say, if you weren't in this era, which I understand perfectly, if you weren't in this era and where you had free agency and where you're paying now, because the salary cap will go up again because they're getting more and more money from television, living on the edge by that, with teams getting millions of dollars more this time around. So you look at Diggs and you say, if I'm sitting there as a general manager, which I was, I'm saying, okay, too much money. I'm not going to pay a 33-year-old player if I guarantee this contract and the next 2 years an average of 20 million plus a year. But on the other hand, then I have to think, okay, I'm going to cut him loose. Now what do I do? I've got to rely on the draft. The draft will always be, and I repeat, will always be a crapshoot, no matter what they tell you, no matter what they had in Indianapolis last week, no matter what you do, it's still a crapshoot, and you don't know if you're going to get a receiver to replace Stephon Diggs. So that's the gamble you take. You get rid of the contract and the money, but on the other hand, you're now exposing yourself without a top wide receiver.
And that's what the Dolphins are doing as well with Tyreek Hill, although he's had some injury problems. Now, if I'm sitting in that general manager seat, I'm looking at these guys, and I'm going historically here. Uh, I'm remembering teams who signed wily veterans to their roster as role players. I'm thinking first of the Packers team that beat the Patriots in the Super Bowl. You know, people forget that team had Jim McMahon on it, had Steve McMichael on it, had Don Beebe on it. I mean, you had a player like Tyreek Hill to your receiving core. He's going to make a few big plays, but going to he's also going to help the younger players develop. You had Stephon Diggs. You know, he's going to do the same thing, and you don't need to bring him in for the whole game. You don't need to start them, but I'll tell you what, you bring in one of those two guys as a third down receiver. I mean, look out. And they're only playing one down a series. I mean, those guys, I'm thinking, could really blow things up for whoever gets a hold of them.
Except for one thing. First of all, in Tyreek Hill, he's coming off a very serious injury. Number one, he's not. In the case of Stephon Diggs, he was almost a year from that injury that he had, which was an Achilles, which is a killer in pro football, and really, basically in all sports. When you get that type of injury, it takes a good deal of time to come back from it. But the other thing is, an example of Tyreek Hill, and maybe he will go back to Kansas City, maybe he won't. He's been trouble every place he's been. So if I'm the general manager, I weigh the idea that occasionally he's going to be a home run hitter. You're going to be able to hit the deep pass to him, and he's going to run by everybody, assuming, Michael, that he comes back uh, pretty good from that Achilles injury. At his age, I don't know. But on the other hand, I've got to weigh that against what do I need to pay him? Because what happens is when these guys, Diggs will be picked up by somebody, I think. But you know what they're going to say to him? We're going to pay you the minimum. The real love and the real story here is with the salary cap and with the millions that are being paid these players the second or third time around, they're not going to get it. And what are you getting in return? I mean, the same way with one of the players that are out there, the big names. Let's take Max Crosby. Who's going to give up two number ones for Max Crosby? You know, he's on the other side, you know, as far as looking at what will happen in his career in the future. Are you giving up two number ones? Somebody's going to be nuts enough to do it, I think, for a guy that's not heading up, but probably heading down to a degree. So there's so many different things that a general manager or a head coach or an owner has to face today, because in some ways, as much as the game has advanced, with the millions of dollars involved in it, it also, there is the negative side. You know, the Rams just are celebrating like they won the Super Bowl because they traded a bunch of number ones to Kansas City for Trent McDuffie.
Well, they traded
Who's the,
one number one number three, and then like a 5 and a 6. Um,
that's
but
that
it's four picks total.
right, but and you never know what can happen in those later rounds. I mean, sometimes you're better off in the later rounds than you are in the first round, but it tells you two things. One, in the case of Kansas City, they need to rebuild, and who knows how Patrick Mahomes is going to be coming off that Achilles, which was really serious. I mean, all Achilles are, but it looked like he was really hurt really badly. So the Kansas City has to, find a way to now rebuild. The Rams think that they're on the edge of going to the Super Bowl. And who doesn't think that? When you're 0-0, but they're now celebrating. But you tell me how many defensive cornerbacks, how many guarantee you a championship?
0.
None. Correct. So they think that's a piece that they need to put together. And frankly, I thought the Rams, even though they lost to Seattle, I thought the Rams were the best team in pro football last year. And then they hit a really bad patch. And then, of course, lost in a thriller to Seattle for Seattle to go to the Super Bowl. But they did have defensive problems. But is one cornerback the answer?
Now,
I don't know.
to
We'll
your
find out.
yeah, right. And to your point, when you think of great defenses, okay, it's usually the front 7 and especially the front 4. Okay, and from what I've heard from players, if you have a strong defensive line that puts pressure on the quarterback, that improves your secondary immediately because the quarterback isn't going to be as accurate and he's going to be rushed. And I think in the Rams case, maybe it would have been better to go after Max Crosby. And I'll tell you what, I don't know what the Packers draft situation is. I mean, I know they gave up a first round and potentially 2 for Micah Parsons, but my goodness, if you had a defense with Max Crosby and Micah Parsons on the same team, I mean, boy, I feel like I could line up in that defense and the Packers would still win a few games.
Well, there's no question, and I've seen it from the days that I was with the Colts and even before that. Show me a good pass rush. Show me a good front 4, or whatever way you want to design it, 3 and 2, whatever. Show me that front 4 that can rush the passer, and I'll tell you, you can throw anybody back there as a defensive back. I'm exaggerating, but all of the great teams, the Purple People Eaters at Minnesota, the Pittsburgh Steel Curtain, the Dallas Doomsday Defense, the Bears '85 team, which might have been the greatest of them all. What they all have? They all had great pass rushes, and that meant that linebackers went to the Hall of Fame, and even defensive backs did. The rush has always been the key to a great defense, and I'm forgetting too, the Ravens of 2000 with their great pass rush and their linebackers Ray Lewis. But you can't have that secondary or even the great linebackers without having that pass rush. No pass rush, you're going nowhere.
Yeah, and occasionally, like in the case of the 80s 49ers with guys like Ronnie Lott, Dwight Hicks, there'd be great secondary players, but, that 49ers team had a great front 7 as well. And that's really the key, I think. And we talk about Patrick Mahomes and how great he was for Kansas City, but that front 7 for the Chiefs won a fair amount of those Super Bowls with Chris Jones, Frank Clark, you know. So they were very important pieces. Occasionally, you get a shutdown quarterback like Darrell Revis Island, you know. But and even Mel Blount. Look, Mel Blount is one of the greatest of all time. But he also had that great front seven
That's the
at the
thing.
same time. Could Mel Blount have won with the Steelers and won as many Super Bowls with a weak front seven and Mel Blount? I don't know. That's hard to say. I
I,
mean,
I,
that's lost
I,
to history.
right, I doubt it. And it's the same way. Show me a top offensive line, and I will show you, uh, even with not a great quarterback, and maybe a good running game, or whatever. If you have a top offensive or defensive line, you're going to win, particularly today. The problem is with 32 teams. Remember, at one time we're at 12, then 14, then 16, and then when the two leagues combined, you had 26 teams. Now you've got six more teams, which means that out of the 32, probably 16 of them, in my opinion, stink. So, what is the most important thing? How do you get by, even if you don't have a great quarterback? Which, yes, you can say you need that. But if you have a top offensive and defensive line, starting in those two areas, you're going to be in the playoffs every year. But how many teams have them? How many teams, Michael, even have one of them? One good either defensive or offensive line. How many can you name? There are none.
So moving back a little bit, you talked about the NFL and its semblance of free agency. Let's kind of talk about and with the game before the money. I named that after um, a saying that Larry McCarron, the former Packers center, he said he always says he played before money, and that was before free agency, and there was the Rozelle rule early on where going back a little bit further, a player could play out their option. It was called. They would have a final year on their contract, and then they could play out their option for one other year, and then they could become a free agent. Well, that one extra year you can get hurt, right? So
Yeah,
and that happened to a lot of players. Then after that, there was what was called the Rozelle rule, where Pete Rozelle, the commissioner, would say like, Upton Bell, well, he signed with the Giants, and now the Giants owe the Colts a second round draft. I'll say he's worth a second round draft pick. The commissioner would decide what kind of compensation it would be. And John Mackey for the Colts filed suit, and that rule got struck down, but inexplicably, sorry, um, it still wound up something similar. Still wound up in the collective bargaining agreement, the next one. Eventually, they got what was called Plan B free agency. I think some of you might remember that, where about, I don't know, 30 some players got protected. Um, and now we got the franchise tag, where they still can protect one
yes.
player from free agency. Can you kind of go over your experience with quote unquote free agency? And remember, baseball has had full free agency since the 70s, early 70s. Same with pro basketball. I'm not sure how long pro hockey has had it, but somehow the NFL has been able to escape full free agency.
And you know what, Michael, I blame the Players Association for that. They, if you look at the Players Association, they're set up to really combat originally under Ed Garvey the NFL and its monopoly. But what has really happened over a period of years is they've gotten each year a bigger piece of the pie, but not the whole pie. Now, let me go back and show you how the Rozelle rule saved me. 1971, my first year as general manager of the Patriots, I mean, it was such a screwed up organization. I remember leaving for the league meetings and saying to the then, they called them secretaries then, let's say assistant, I said, just make sure that they send out, somebody in here sends out the option letters, which was that you're picking up the player's option for the year. And that's the only way you protect your team. So when I got back, I got a call from Fred, no, not Fred, from Phil Olson, who was the number one choice of the Patriots the year before and had hurt his knee. Merlin Olson's brother, who was considered a top defensive prospect. I got a call from his lawyer and he said, Mr. Bell, I now declare Phil Olson a free agent. I said to him, what the hell are you talking about? And he said that, well, he said, you never picked up his option. I said, I'm sure we did. So then I began to get calls from other players saying, did you send my option letter yet? And so what I realized is the whole team were free agents.
Oh, goodness.
And luckily, it never made the newspapers at that time or radio and TV. So what I immediately did is I had the secretary send out option letters and even gave bonuses. The players are calling me and saying, why they get a bonus? And of course, I never said to them because I forgot to send out your option letters. Now, in the case of Olson, he did eventually sign with the Rams, and Rozelle stepped in and gave for the mistake I made. What he did was he said, well, he was drafted number one. The Rams have to, and they bitched and moaned about it. And they said we shouldn't have to give up anything, but the Rams had to give me a first round draft choice. Then a year later, I made a deal with the Giants and sent the Giants my number one choice for Fred Dreyer, who I loved. I had scouted him at San Diego State. Wow. And actually, that's when I first met John Madden, who was an assistant coach there. And I loved him, a great pass rusher. And I said, I want to take a chance on him. I think we have a pretty good defensive line. So I traded the number one, Giants, and then tried to sign Fred Dreyer. And kind of the ownership here, who were fractured, stepped in and said, it's too much money. I guarantee them. You ready for this? Which they thought was too much money. This is 1972. I guaranteed him $75,000 a year. And they thought it was too much money and killed it. So I had to let him go. And Rozelle stepped in again and saved me by declaring the Rams had to give me, because I had given the Giants a number one, they said that the Rams had to give me a number one. So twice I was saved by the Rozelle rule. Years later, I thought, this is a bad rule because the players can still be controlled. And they're still, if you want to franchise a player today, although I notice less and less teams are doing it now, but if you want to franchise a player, then you've got to pay him equal of what the top players would be making in his position, but you can still hold him back from free agency.
Yeah, which is amazing, and that stems back to Pat Bowlen, the Broncos owner, during an owners meeting when they were finally giving up Plan B free agency and moving into the free agency, towards the free agency that every other sport has. and that you and I have, right? We can sign with
Yeah.
any employer. We can take a job with anybody. Pro football players can't necessarily do that. Anyway, Pat Bolin at one of the meetings said, I can't lose John Elway. I can't. I just he's our entire team. He's our franchise. And there used to be a term franchise player that was used a lot in sports. Um, and so they created the franchise tag for the franchise player. Now, a lot of players who get tagged with the franchise tag are not anywhere near John Elway or Dan Marino or anybody else who is it was meant to really be if a player is the face of the franchise, um, that player could be protected. Um, I don't know if George Pickens is the face of the Cowboys franchise. I don't mean to pick him out, uh, to single him out. He's just the one guy I can think of right now who got the franchise tag this year. But that's how the franchise tag came to be. And Upton, what are some of your memories of the pre free agency era? Oh, there was one other thing I wanted to add. I'm sorry. In 1977, Norm Thompson, just to put things into perspective for people, in 1977, Norm Thompson, he was a defensive back. He either went from the Cardinals to the Colts or the Colts to the Cardinals. That was in 1977. There was not another player that changed teams via some sort of free agency until after 1985 or 1986 when Wilbur Marshall went from the Bears to Washington. Okay? That is a completely different landscape. We're talking about an entire decade of nobody changing teams.
Well, let me take you back to the original. You probably never heard the story, or maybe you did. Maybe our audience never heard it. The first guy that threatened and actually sued the NFL in the 50s was a player by the name of Bud Grant, who, of course, went on to become the great Hall of Fame coach with the Minnesota Vikings. Bud Grant was a damn good player with the Philadelphia Eagles. And actually, the option clause was my father had put the option clause in basically in the beginning to protect clubs because in those days clubs could lose their players without the option, and everybody was trying to survive. You had 12 teams, but Grant actually sued, called my father all sorts of names, and sued him, and finally lost his case at that time, and went and played in Canada, and of course had a hell of a career in Canada. Then ended up coming from Canada to the Minnesota Vikings, but he was the first guy that challenged that option clause and wanted to play in free agency and sign with another team. How many people know that story? They don't.
I didn't know that one.
Yeah, and it's funny because you can go back in history and see some of his comments about it, about Burt Bell. He said something like, I'm paraphrasing, he said, Burt Bell ain't God to me. And really took him on. I thought to myself, I mean, no player was going to challenge the commissioner of the NFL at that time, and particularly Burt Bell, who didn't take any crap from anybody. And actually, I believe won the case, and then Bud Grant went to Canada. Now, the other guy I drafted and is in the Hall of Fame was a guy by the name of Ted Hendricks, the bad sort. He had a great career with the Patriots, and then I'm sorry,
with the Colts.
With the Colts.
Yeah.
And so when we signed him with the Colts, he eventually played out his option and went to the Packers for a year. I don't know all the mechanics of it, and then went from the Packers to the Raiders. and had a great career there too. The Mad Stork. So he did challenge it, and he did. I don't know all the mechanics of it, but ended up with the Packers for 1 year, and then played it out and went to the Raiders for the rest of his career. Had a great career there, and as I said, a Hall of Famer. So there were people that did challenge it, and the Grant story. If people paid attention then, and football players had no power back in the 50s, but Grant was the first to really challenge the whole thing. And where I really think, even today, I question why the Players Association doesn't get together with their lawyers and say, baseball has free agency, basketball has free agency, hockey has free agency. Why does the NFL, which is the most popular sport of them all, why does it not have total free agency? Why can you, even though you pay the guy the equivalent of what the top players are making, why are you able to franchise a player? It's BS.
Yeah, and when you say baseball has free agency, basketball has free agency, you know, they've had that for 40 years, going on 50 years. And I mean, that kind of puts it in perspective. The NFL just, for whatever reason, I don't know if it's a combination of the union not being able to get the job done. I don't know if it's the owners just being that much more shrewd about it. I don't know what it is, but it is remarkable to me that we still don't have full on free agency. And then you get into guaranteed contracts and what money is truly guaranteed, what money is not, and a lot of players get released before their contract's up, and they don't get that full amount of their contract, even though they're still players who can play in the league at a high level.
Well, that you brought up. That's the difference. You have to give up one for the other. When it was back in the 60s and 70s, and to a degree into the 80s, but when it was way back then, you could play longer and make less money, but you could, and barring injury, which is always right around the corner in the NFL, but you could play a lot longer then than you can now. And you're right about when they announce so and so is signed for like 80 or $100 million. First thing I ask is how much is guaranteed, and so they say 5 years at 40 million a year. What it really is, you look and say, what is the guaranteed money? And how many years is the money guaranteed? And what you're going to find on a 5-year contract is maybe the first year, 2 years are guaranteed, as we saw what happened with Stephon Diggs. I mean, it's crap what they throw out there, because you're never going to last long enough to make that money at the tail end. Everybody knows that. Now in baseball, when they say you've signed a contract for this certain amount guaranteed, what the club has to decide is this guy, the last 3 years of his contract is probably either not going to be around or not nearly as good as he was before. But then baseball says, I want the person, and so they eat the contract. They don't eat any contracts in the NFL. They eat the player.
Yeah, and I'm not so sure if we should be laughing about that, because these are players that we absolutely love, who are subject to just how the system works, and that's generally From my understanding, that's generally negotiated through the collective bargaining agreement. The rules for this sort of thing. Am I correct there, Upton?
Well, yeah, it is, and a lot of people then looked and complained about the idea that Gene Upshaw, who is the president of the Players Association, former Oakland Raiders player and Hall of Famer, and he was the head of the Players Association, and he and Paul Tagliabue had this great relationship, and I think that what happened out of it is that Tagliabue kind of got what he wanted, but also the Players Association, that was their biggest chance to grab everything they could. And they grabbed a lot to the point of then the owners stepped in and said to Tagliabue, "Stop it. I think it was Jerry Jones that said, "Stop it. We're giving the store away to the players." So in all the other sports, they've essentially given the store away to the players, who are, frankly, they are the show. But in the NFL, that's not true. And so we still have it. Not only that, what the NFL has done so well is as soon as the Super Bowl is over, then you assume that that's the end of the story. But they continue on with the player tryouts in Indianapolis. Then now we're into free agency, and all the excitement and heavy breathing is over free agency. And then the next thing you know, you're into the draft, and that is a big thing. And before you know it, you've got OTAs, and then you're into training camp. So what used to be an off season, and is in all the other sports, is that the NFL has really gotten smart, the league office, and the people, the powers to be, including Roger Goodell, and they've made it a year-round thing. And the same way they keep announcing this and that. All right, each team is now going to play somewhere in Europe or South America. This is the contract deals that we're going to be making. They're always in the news. If I turn on, which I do each day, on to ESPN and Get Up, and then followed by their other shows, they talk about the NFL as much, if not more, and you're in the middle of the season approaching the basketball and hockey playoffs, you wouldn't think they existed. It's all NFL.
It is, and it never was like that before. I mean, it would go dormant. And also, I mean, the season lasts a lot longer too. I mean, the Super Bowl when I grew up happened in mid-January, and the NFL championship game when you were growing up, and even while you were an adult working in the league, that was done
December.
Shortly after Christmas, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, the greatest game ever played. The first sudden death game, I was there. Giants and the Colts. That was December 27th. The Eagles Packers championship game in 1960 was the day after Christmas.
On a Monday, which
yeah.
is important to point out. On a Monday because they didn't want to have a game on Christmas.
That's correct. I mean, it was really big. But then the two Super Bowls that I was involved with the Colts, when we lost to the Jets, and then later beat the Cowboys 3 years later. Basically, those were in early January. I think it was like the second week in January that we played both times, right after New Year. I mean, that they didn't want the season to go on forever. Now, if the NFL had their way, the Super Bowl would be in April. They've got it later and later next year. It's what, on President's Day?
It's actually on Valentine's Day. The Super Bowl is going to be on Valentine's Day next year.
Oh my God!
Just an early tip to all you guys out there. Start coming up with a plan here. You might need a game plan. It's a balanced Valentine's Day with Super Bowl Sunday. That's going to be a reality, and it's going to show that the NFL is bigger than Valentine's Day.
Well, yeah, I mean,
Um,
how soon will they be playing on Easter? Which brings up the other side of it, is that what about the player? What about the player? Let's start out with playing everywhere. That each team will be required to play overseas. What does that mean for the player? What does it mean for the player to have to play if you're successful, at least into January and February, if your team advances? What does it mean to the player's body? And what does Thursday night football mean? And you have Monday night, you have Thursday night. Pretty soon you'll have Friday and Saturday night, and the least people being considered are the players. They are the ones. Everybody else is doing well, but what about the players? Well, you know what the league will say, which is partially true, that the more money they make, and they're going to make more and more, they're going to be going to streaming services, and we're going to have to pay for all of this crap. But basically, the player, even though they're getting more and more money, their careers, how long are their careers going to be?
three
You
and
know
a
what?
half years.
Yep, that 3.5 years, if they're lucky.
And let's not kind of overlook the fact that rookie contracts are 4 years. Okay, so I could be wrong, but I don't think that's a coincidence.
No, well, look at Drake May. Had a great year this year, and up to the Super Bowl when he really got injured. I mean, he was neck and neck with Matthew Stafford for MVP. He's making peanuts, that, and they have to start negotiating with him basically. So that's what happened when players were being overpaid in the draft. They went the opposite way and said, now no matter how good you are, you're 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 going to be, under contract for 4 years. You can't move from what that initial contract is. You get a little bit more each year. But think about that. That 4 years is basically a half a year more than the average life of a player.
Yeah, yeah, it's really amazing. Well,
And by the way, Michael, don't think that they haven't figured that out. You know, let's go 4 years. The average player is 3.5 years. The NFL is so smart and so far ahead of all of these other leagues. Maybe someday it will come back to haunt them. But you don't think somebody sat down and said, you know what? We're tired of paying these big bonuses and these guaranteed contracts to these rookies coming out. So let's put it at 4 years. And then somebody says, oh my gosh, the average life of a player is 3.5 years. Let's make it four. They're no dummies.
yeah, that's what I say. I can't say this for a fact, but I have a hunch that that's not a coincidence. That the rookie contracts are set at 4 years. Well, Upton, and people, listeners, let's move on a little bit here. And we lost a legend this week, Coach Lou Holtz. Of course, a lot of us, at least my generation, we remember him as the great head coach for Notre Dame. Of course, he was head coach at Arkansas before that.
Everywhere. He coached everywhere.
And Upton, you have some memories to share of the great Lou Holtz. What were some of the stories you'd like to share about him?
Well, he was very controversial. He did turn many programs around, particularly Notre Dame. But when I had my team in Charlotte, North Carolina, he was the head coach at North Carolina State, football coach. And of course, in North Carolina, the only thing that really counts is basketball, and particularly the University of North Carolina. But Holtz went to North Carolina State, which was, basically nowheresville in college football, and he really turned them around. He was a very controversial subject there, as he was every place that he really went. But I can remember this particular incident where there was a uh, a college professor who was constantly criticizing Holtz and his methods as a head coach at North Carolina State, and even to the point of where used to come to practice. And so Holtz one day, and this was like front page news, Holtz one day went over to him wherever he was, maybe he was in the stands on the field somewhere, and threw him off the field and said, get the hell out of here. And basically, then the question that came up was, does a college professor have the right to criticize a coach, and can the coach then throw him off the field? I was laughing like hell. I said, I'd love to meet this guy. I never did. I said, what a character. I mean, he really brought something to North Carolina State, and then he jumped from place to place to place. But he was the type of coach that you probably wouldn't have today, probably couldn't get away with it like Bear Bryant and many of the other coaches that were somewhat dictators. But he was, if you listen to him speak, the guy was, even though I said to myself, oh, I think he's full of it, but he was really, I could see where he could, maybe not today, really inspire young kids. And that's basically, I mean, you look at Notre Dame. Notre Dame had two great coaches before him, but with long time in the desert after those coaches. They had Frank Leahy, and then they had Ara Parsegian, who came from Northwestern to Notre Dame and turned them around too in the 60s. And then they had a long period where, everybody expected Notre Dame to always win and always be like number one or near the top. And they really made some poor choices for coaches and poor choices in recruiting. And then in comes Holtz, who really delivered a completely different message. And the one thing that you hear people even talk now, a couple of days after his death, is that he could really recruit kids. That the parents, that he went in and really never talked directly to the kids. Sitting there, he would go in and talk to the parent, and it was the parents, as you know, that in most cases decided where their kids were going to go, and that he was so good at it, and he was so good at the players to inspire them to play harder and better. But his recruiting was amazing, and then their controversial games against Miami, the Catholics versus the convicts, if you remember that game.
Oh, sure.
People might not remember it, the bitterness between the two of them and the things that went on. But I think to me, I'll always remember him as the coach at Notre Dame and what he did. He went to other places after that, and like a lot of players that can't give up playing, he couldn't give up coaching and got himself into trouble. Well, he was in trouble every place he was, but that's the package that you bought with him. But he was a brilliant motivator, and today it's a lot harder to do that because these kids are really froze now. This was before players would be signing contracts to make a lot of money for 1 or 2 years and then jump to another place. That never happened. Can you imagine Holtz having to deal with a kid that came in and said, Coach, I love you this year, but I'm getting $2 million to go to whatever, I'm going to get $2 million to go to Michigan or someplace else. That never, Holtz couldn't have, I don't think, coached in that era.
Well, I remember when he left Notre Dame, and I kind of shook my head at the statement. he said that he was leaving because he didn't feel like he could recruit anymore. And I was thinking, like, you're at Notre Dame, isn't that just itself? Like, isn't that just going to sell itself? So he even encountered changes that he didn't like during and that he had trouble adapting to in his day. So so there's that aspect as well. Yeah, he probably wouldn't have have fared the same or had difficulty adjusting to
Well, you know
what the landscape is now.
well, Michael, think of all of those coaches of the past and how pliant and different kids were then. Do you think Bear Bryant would exist today? I doubt it. Parsegian? I doubt it. Lou Holtz? I doubt it. Think of those giants, particularly Bear Bryant. I remember when I first went to Alabama for one of their spring practices. And Bear Bryant was up in the tower. I mean, it was like Jesus looking down on the poor supplicant players. And all you knew is, I remember Gil Brandt telling me once, if you got invited up in the tower, you were something special. And so if you were a scout and or director of player personnel like I was, well, I went there as a scout and then as a personnel director. If you went there and you got invited up in the tower, you had made it because uh, you're going to get a lot of personal information, which was important then. I never was invited up in the tower, but Howard Snellenberger, who later on went from and was one of the best coaches at Alabama, then went to Miami with Shula, and the guy I wanted to hire if I'd still stayed with the Patriots. And he's the guy that gave me all the information. But I never talked to Jesus Christ, who was really Bear Bryant. Those guys and like Frank Leahy and people like that people today would only recognize their names if they did, is they dealt with a different kid who were in awe. If Bear Bryant came into your home and said, boy, I want you to come to Alabama, you're going to Alabama.
That's the way it was. They had that reverence. Darrell Royal was another um, coach in that, especially in the state of Texas.
Well,
Um,
let me tell you about Darrell Royal. I was at Texas and it was on a Friday. And I looked at film in the morning. I wanted to go to practice in the afternoon. The guy said to me, I'm sorry, Mr. Bell, said, President Lyndon Johnson's coming in the afternoon for practice, and we don't want any of you scouts around here. So that's the power that Texas and Darrell Royal had. You're right. That's another guy that you can think about that really ruled the world. Frank Boyles at Arkansas. That they were power people. When you went in there, you never talked to the head coach. You talked to one of his assistants. If you got time with the head coach, you were something special. And that rarely happened. Maybe at practice you might shimmy up to coach and say, Coach, he really looks really good. And then they might throw a few bouquets at your feet. But that's the way it was. And now it's totally different. I even think in the pros, how many coaches? Mike Vrabel really is a combination of like Bill Belichick, the tough old guy, although he's not old, and the new school guy that waits after every game to hug his players. Jesus, I said to myself, this guy's hugging players? You would never see that. But that's the way some coaches today look at all the new guys being hired, and it doesn't mean they'll be successful. They're a different breed. They've come up in a different way, and they're wired in a different way. Part of the players give them the speech, give them I love you, but also look at the mechanics of the game. It's a totally different game in the pros too. You you even though you control these guys, and to a degree you have to be somewhat nice to them.
All right. Well, Upton, great perspective, and we honor Coach Holtz, and we hope you've enjoyed this episode of Unvarnished Football. Please remember to visit thegamebeforethemoney.com, and actually, as you do that, check out unvarnishedfootball.com. That is our website, and you can listen to all episodes of Unvarnished Football through that website. And of course, uptonbell.com is another great website for you to check out. We'll be back next Thursday with some more great unvarnished talk about the game we love. No fluff, no filler, just football.